A man in a faded bathrobe shuffled under a weak streetlight on Sullivan Street. His slippers dragged across the pavement, the sound barely louder than the hum of the bulb above him. His lips moved, words spilling out that no one else could understand. A cab slowed at the corner, the driver giving him one glance before rolling on. A woman walking her dog crossed to the other side of the street, shaking her head. To the neighborhood, he was just the local oddball, another lost soul wandering the village after midnight. But in a parked car a few yards away, two FBI agents leaned forward, notebooks open on their laps. The older one whispered, "There he is," as if afraid that raising his voice might break the spell. They watched as the robe-wrapped man pointed at nothing, nodded at no one, and kept moving. His figure looked broken, fragile. But the men in the car knew the file attached to this name. They knew about the bodies, the backroom deals, the whispers on every corner. They knew he wasn't just a madman. He was suspected to be the boss of the most powerful crime family in America.
So, which was it?
Was Vincent the Chin Gigante insane, or was he the smartest mobster alive? That question haunted everyone who crossed his path. Neighbors pitted him. Kids laughed at him. Agents obsessed over him. Judges read medical reports and shook their heads. And through it all, Vincent shuffled on, his robe flapping, his eyes blank, his lips mumbling nonsense. If it was an act, it was the greatest performance the underworld had ever seen. The robe wasn't just clothing.
It was a costume.
The muttering wasn't madness. It was a script, and the city became his stage. Every night the performance repeated. He would wander the block, stand at lampposts as if measuring them, pause at windows as if listening to voices no one else could hear. One night, he gestured toward a bakery's empty display case, muttering as though he were in conversation. The shopkeeper, sweeping inside, whispered to his wife, "That poor man has lost his mind." She nodded. Pity was easier than fear. But in the FBI's surveillance van, the agents weren't fooled, or at least they told themselves they weren't. Still, their notes always read the same. Subject appears incoherent. Slippers. No visible contact. The file grew thicker, the photos stacked higher, but evidence slipped away like smoke. Here's the genius. People believe what they see. And what they saw was a man unraveling. Judges trusted doctors. Doctors trusted their eyes. And every photo of Vincent in that robe became another brick in the wall between him and prison. Pity on one side, suspicion on the other, and in between, a man orchestrating a criminal empire from the shadows. Inside the Genovese family, no one dared laugh. They knew the truth. Orders still came. Money still flowed. Fear still followed his name. The robe was armor, the muttering camouflage. To the world, he looked harmless. To his men, he was untouchable. Invisibility had always been his strength. He had learned it as a boy in the crowded tenements of Little Italy, where silence was survival. He had practiced it in the boxing ring, where hiding pain was the difference between winning and losing. Now, in middle age, he turned invisibility into legend. Even his enemies struggled to make sense of him. How can that man be running anything? One rival was heard whispering in a cafe. The question was half disbelief, half fear. Because deep down, they knew appearances meant nothing. The robe was only the last act of a play that had started long ago. And this was the brilliance of Vincent Gigante. He blurred the line between illusion and reality until no one, not even his family at times, was sure where the performance ended and the man began. But to understand how a boy from a poor Italian family grew into this ghostly figure who fooled the law for decades, you have to rewind. To rooms where 5 brothers shared space and hunger. To a father bending over watch gears until his eyes strained. To a mother lighting candles, whispering prayers over her children. To a boy who learned early that respect was survival, that silence was power. Because before there was the robe, before the muttering, before the FBI staked out his block, there was just Vincent, quiet, watchful, underestimated. A boy shaped by poverty, discipline, and the sharp edges of a city that didn't forgive weakness. And if you trace the line from that boy to the man in the robe, you'll see it wasn't madness at all. It was strategy, a performance decades in the making. The slippered feet, The vacant stares, the nonsense words under the streetlight, those were just the final touches of a mask he had been crafting his entire life. So the question remains, was Vincent the Chin Gigante truly insane? Or was he the most brilliant trickster the FBI ever faced? The answer begins long before the robe. It begins in the cramped apartments of Greenwich Village, where a boy learned how to take punches without flinching, how to listen more than he spoke, and how to make the world underestimate him. Because the robe was never the start. It was only the ending to a story that had been building, one careful step at a time. The streets of Greenwich Village in the 1930s were alive with noise. Vendors shouted over one another, carts rattled across uneven stones, and the air carried the smell of bread, coal smoke, and sweat. Inside a cramped tenement on Thompson Street, a mother sat by a flickering candle, rocking her newborn in her arms. The boy's name was Vincenzo Gigante. Nobody outside that tiny room knew it, but this child would one day wear a bathrobe that fooled the FBI for decades. His father bent over watch gears all day, repairing delicate springs until his back ached. His mother whispered prayers over each of her 5 sons, asking God to spare them from the hunger that gnawed at their stomachs. Poverty was not just a fact of life. It was the air they breathed. In those narrow hallways, children learned fast that weakness invited cruelty. If you couldn't fight, you became a target. Respect was worth more than toys, more than food. Vincent was small, quiet, the kind of boy others overlooked. But he had sharp eyes. He noticed the way older boys carried themselves, how they used silence like a weapon. He noticed the men in cafes who wore pressed coats and heavy rings, men who spoke softly yet commanded entire blocks. He didn't understand who they were, not yet, but he felt their gravity. In the alleys, fights broke out over scraps of food or games played too rough. Vincent learned the first rule early: never show pain. A boy who cried out was a boy who lost, no matter how the fight ended. He took punches, wiped the blood from his lip, and kept his face blank. Inside the apartment, his father urged him to work honestly, telling him dignity lived in steady labor. His mother pressed a rosary into his hand, whispering, "God is watching." But outside those doors, silence and toughness mattered more than prayers. By his teenage years, the 1940s had brought another outlet: boxing. In neighborhoods like his, boxing gyms were ladders for poor boys. The rooms reeked of sweat and liniment, the air thick with shouts of trainers and the thud of gloves on leather. For Vincent, the ring wasn't just a way to make a few dollars. It was a classroom. He learned timing, patience, and the art of masking pain. He wasn't flashy, but he was steady. A fighter who could take a hit, wait, and strike only when it mattered. The locals gave him a nickname that stuck. His mother's thick Italian accent stretched Vincenzo into Cinzenzo, and the boys on the block shortened it to Chin. In the ring, the name fit, the jaw that could take punishment. On the streets, it carried weight of its own. The Chin was no longer just another neighborhood kid. He was someone to watch. But boxing was a brutal teacher. Victories brought applause, but applause faded. The money barely covered rent, and the scars lasted longer than the cheers. Vincent saw older fighters with broken hands and ruined faces, men who could no longer pay their bills. He realized the ring could never offer real security. Meanwhile, the men in dark coats at the cafes still sipped espresso, their power untouched by age or injury. Respect didn't fade for them. Their kind of power lasted. Boxing is for fools, an older fighter once told him, sitting on the edge of a wooden bench, hands wrapped in tape that couldn't hide the swelling. One bad punch and you're finished. Those guys out there in the suits, they don't take punches. They give orders. Vincent listened. The words sank deep. Soon the errands began. A message delivered here, a package carried there. Nothing violent at first, nothing dramatic. Just small tasks for men whose names carried weight. Vincent didn't brag. He didn't ask questions. He did what was asked, quietly, efficiently. In a world where loose talk could mean death, silence was more valuable than fists. Neighbors started whispering. The Chin's not in the gym as much anymore. He's running with those guys from the cafes. Some shook their heads, worried. Others nodded, impressed. But everyone noticed. For Vincent, each errand was another step away from the ring and deeper into the shadows. He hadn't chosen one night to leave boxing behind. It happened like a slow tide. One day he was a fighter. The next, he was standing outside a social club, waiting for men who never smiled to finish their meetings. Respect came differently now, not in cheers, but in nods. And nods, he realized, lasted longer. At home, his father still begged him to stay honest. "Use your hands for work, not for this," he pleaded, motioning at the suits Vincent was now seen with. His mother prayed harder, lighting more candles, whispering more urgently. But prayers didn't put food on the table. And outside, the streets whispered louder than God. Poverty teaches lessons no classroom can. It whispers shortcuts, promises belonging, tempts with security that honest work cannot match. Vincent was listening. He saw that invisibility was his advantage. While others showed off, he stayed in the background. While others boasted, he stayed quiet. That quiet was noticed. It was respect without noise. In the gyms, his gloves gathered dust. In the cafes, his presence grew heavier. He was no longer just the chin in the ring. He was the chin in the shadows. But with shadows came risk. The men he served lived in a world where one mistake could cost your life. To survive, Vincent had to sharpen every instinct. He studied faces the way other boys studied scorecards. He watched for the twitch of betrayal, the flicker of hesitation. He kept his own face calm, never giving anything away. Fear lived inside him, but no one ever saw it. And all of this, his silence, his patience, his invisibility, was shaping him for something greater. He didn't know it yet, but the robe and slippers, the muttering on Sullivan Street, were just extensions of these lessons. He was already practicing the art of being underestimated. He was already rehearsing a role that would one day become his armor. By the late 1940s, the boy who once shadowboxed in alleys was shadowing men whose names carried power across the city. The ring was behind him, the streets were in front of him, and loyalty was about to pull him across a line he could never step back from. That line wasn't drawn in chalk or in ropes. It was drawn in blood, in silence, in promises whispered in back rooms. And soon, Vincent Gigani, the chin, would be asked to prove himself in a way that no fight in the ring could ever compare to. Because the robe and the muttering, the madness and the illusion, those were years away. But the seeds of the odd father were planted here, in the hunger of a poor tenement, in the lessons of the boxing ring, and in the whispers of the men who saw his silence as something more dangerous than fists. And when Vito Genovese's shadow fell over him, Vincent would step into a world where silence became power, and power demanded loyalty. By the early 1950s, the world outside Vincent Gigani's tenement walls had changed. The war was over, the city was booming, and the mob was reshaping itself in the shadows of skyscrapers that stretched higher every year. Vincent, no longer just a neighborhood fighter, had crossed into something far more dangerous. The boy who once delivered envelopes now carried whispers and orders. The quiet boxer was becoming a soldier in the Genovese family. It didn't happen overnight. At first, it was the small things, sitting outside a cafe until a meeting ended, escorting envelopes that carried not just money but messages, stepping into apartments where curtains were always drawn. The jobs were tests, simple on the surface, deadly if mishandled. And Vincent never failed. He didn't ask questions. He didn't brag. He didn't make mistakes. Silence had become his trademark. One night, an older soldier slapped him on the back after a successful collection. "You've got something most of these kids don't," he said, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. "You shut your mouth." Vincent only nodded. The compliment was enough. In a world where words got men killed, silence made you valuable. That value drew the attention of the one man whose approval mattered most, Vito Genovese. Ruthless, ambitious, feared, Genovese was the kind of man who could turn a whisper into a sentence and a nod into a death order. He didn't need to roar. His calmness was scarier than rage. And when Vito noticed Vincent, it wasn't because the chin was flashy or loud. It was because he wasn't. Genovese tested him, first with collections, then with more delicate jobs. A gambler who owed too much. A union man who needed reminding where his loyalties belonged. In each case, Vincent acted with the same steady control he'd learned in the ring. He didn't rush. He didn't let emotion drive him. He applied pressure slowly, until the other man bent. The message got delivered, and no unnecessary noise followed. Genovese liked that. Noise drew attention. Vincent understood invisibility. He started to be seen in Genovese's orbit. Not in the center, never in the center, but close enough to show trust. When Genovese walked into a social club, Vincent was there at the edge of the room, quiet, watchful. When meetings ended, he lingered long enough to take in the nods, the gestures, the way decisions were made, without raising voices. He was studying, absorbing, learning how power truly worked. And power, he saw, wasn't about yelling or waving guns. It was about silence. It was about patience. It was about knowing when to act and when to let others believe you were harmless. The same lessons that had once made him survive in alleys, that had once steadied him in boxing rings, were now shaping him into something more. By now, the neighborhood had changed the way it spoke about him. The Chin wasn't just the kid from the gym. He was someone to tread carefully around. Mothers warned their sons not to cross him. Men nodded politely when he entered a room. Respect was no longer a struggle. It came naturally now, whispered and unspoken, the kind that carried weight. Still, in the world of the mob, loyalty wasn't just about silence or small jobs. It had to be proven. Words meant nothing. Actions were everything. And Vincent knew his moment of proof was coming. That moment began in hushed conversations between Genovese and his closest men. Vito wanted what Frank Costello had. Costello was the prime minister of the mob, a man who had balanced politics and power with a calm hand. But in Vito's eyes, that calmness was weakness. He wanted Costello gone. To take the throne, Genovese needed someone loyal, steady, and silent to carry out the message. That someone was Vincent. Late one evening in 1957, Genovese's men pulled him aside. One of them leaned in close, his breath carrying the smell of whiskey. "The boss has a job for you," he said quietly. "This is bigger than envelopes. Bigger than collections." He let the words hang in the air. "It's time to prove yourself." Vincent didn't flinch. He only nodded. The job was clear. Frank Costello had to be eliminated. For Vincent, it was the ultimate test. He was no longer playing at the edges of shadows. He was stepping directly into them. The boxer, who once masked pain in the ring, was about to mask fear in a way he had never done before. This wasn't a fight with gloves. This was an act that could alter the balance of the entire underworld. The plan was set. Costello would be ambushed outside his apartment building on Central Park West. Vincent was handed a pistol. He held it, feeling its weight, steadying his breath as if preparing for a bout. In the ring, he had always known that hesitation could cost you the fight. Out here, hesitation could cost him his life. But even as he prepared, the paradox grew sharper. The quiet, underestimated boy from Sullivan Street, the fighter known for taking punches without flinching, was about to step into history as both pawn and player. Was he just another soldier proving loyalty? Or was he already shaping himself into something greater, a man who would one day use invisibility and illusion to rule the game? The night approached. Costello moved through his routines, unaware of what waited. Vincent walked the streets with the pistol hidden, his step slow, his face unreadable. Around him, the city carried on as always, cabs honking, radios spilling music into the night air, couples laughing after dinner. Nobody could guess the collision that was about to unfold. In those moments before the trigger was pulled, Vincent carried not just the weight of his own life, but the weight of an entire family's ambition. Genovese had trusted him with more than a task. He had trusted him with the future. And with that trust, Vincent's place in history was sealed. What happened next would echo for decades. A gun, a hallway, a man known as the prime minister of the mob, and a shot that would miss by inches but still succeed in changing everything. The robe, the slippers, the muttering, they were still years away. But the man who would wear them was born here, in the shadows of Genovese's ambition, in the silence of a soldier who knew that sometimes invisibility was the sharpest weapon of all. So when Vincent lifted the pistol that night, it wasn't just an order he was carrying out. It was his initiation into legend. Was he simply proving loyalty to a ruthless boss? Or was this the first act in the performance of a lifetime, the act that would one day make the world wonder whether they were watching madness or genius? The marble lobby of Frank Costello's apartment building gleamed under soft light. The doorman tipped his cap as the Prime Minister of the underworld returned home. Costello walked with the calmness of a man who had survived decades of mob politics, a man whose word could shift votes in Albany and silence rivals in Harlem. His reign had been steady, measured, quiet. But in Vito Genovese's eyes, that calmness had become weakness. And tonight, Genovese's ambition carried a pistol. Vincent Giganti waited in the shadows near the lobby entrance, his hands tight around the grip of the gun. 29 years old, once a boxer, now a soldier trusted by Vito himself. The test he had always known was coming had finally arrived. This was no collection. No warning. This was blood loyalty. Outside, the city buzzed as if unaware of the storm brewing inside that elegant building. Cabs honked. Radios hummed Sinatra through half-open windows. Couples strolled arm in arm. But for Vincent, the world narrowed to one sound, his own heartbeat, pounding steady as a drum in his ears. The door clicked. Costello stepped into the lobby, shoes echoing against marble. His shoulders hunched slightly from age, but his presence still carried authority. He nodded at the doorman, his voice calm. "Good evening." Vincent stepped forward. The pistol rose. The shot cracked like thunder in the confined space. Costello staggered, his hand flying to his head. Blood seeped between his fingers. His eyes wide, dazed, searching. But he did not fall. The bullet had grazed him, cutting his scalp, sparing his life by inches. The doorman shouted, rushing toward him. "Mr. Costello." Vincent froze for a fraction of a second. Too long, too human. Then he turned and bolted, the pistol still hot in his hand, disappearing into the chaos of a night. Time seemed to fracture in that moment. Vincent had failed to kill. And yet, in the twisted logic of the underworld, the shot was enough. Later, in the hospital, police pressed Costello for answers. Blood still trickled from the wound, his head bandaged, his face pale.
"Who shot you?" they asked.
Costello's voice was steady, even as he winced. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." That single line sealed his fate. Omerta, the code of silence, held even in blood. By refusing to name his attacker, Costello effectively surrendered his throne. Within days, he announced he was stepping down, retreating from power. And Genovese stepped in. For the FBI, the shooting was another frustration. Everyone knew Genovese wanted Costello gone. Everyone knew Vincent Giganti was his loyal soldier. But knowing was not proving. Without Costello's testimony, the case evaporated. Vincent walked free. The files grew thicker, the suspicion deeper, but the evidence dissolved like fog. Inside the mob, however, Vincent's name now carried a new weight. He had pulled the trigger on the Prime Minister. Even if the bullet had only grazed, the message was clear. He had proven his loyalty with his own hand. The Chin was no longer just a soldier. He was an enforcer, a man who had earned his place in the shadow of Vito Genovese. And yet, those who knew him best whispered that the shooting lingered in his conscience. He was still young, still human. He had come within inches of ending a life. Some nights, they said, his silence was heavier than before, his eyes darker. He had done what loyalty demanded, but the act left a mark. Still, the mob didn't care about his inner turmoil. They cared about results. And the result was simple. Genovese now reigned supreme, and Vincent was the man who made it possible. "Good work," one of Genovese's lieutenants muttered, clapping him on the shoulder in a smoke-filled cafe days later. "The boss won't forget this." Vincent only nodded. He had no words to give. He never did. But the FBI agents watching from their cars, sipping cold coffee, scribbling in notebooks, felt the shift too. They knew this wasn't just another mob shooting. This was a change in the tide. One old order was dying, another rising. And the quiet man in the bathrobe, though he wasn't wearing it yet, was moving closer to the center of it all. The paradox grew sharper. On one side, he was the loyal soldier, following orders, proving himself with a pistol. On the other, he was already showing the traits that would define his legend: invisibility, patience, silence. Was he just a pawn in Genovese's game, or was he already shaping himself into something far more dangerous? In the cafes of the village, old men whispered over espresso. The chin pulled the trigger. One said, lowering his voice, "Costello's finished." Another shook his head. "He's crazy to do that." The first leaned closer. "Crazy?
No.
Smart. Smart enough to rise." But the truth wasn't so clean. Vincent himself carried the weight of that night for years. The bullet had missed its mark, but its echo followed him. It was the sound of loyalty and betrayal, of ambition and survival. It was the sound of a life that could never again be ordinary. And in the shadows of New York, the robe and slippers were still far away. But the seeds were growing. Because in that lobby, in that split second when his bullet grazed instead of killed, Vincent Giganti learned something vital. Survival wasn't about glory or headlines. It was about perception, about illusion, about making the world believe what you wanted them to believe. The robe would come later. The muttering, the vacant stares, the slippers shuffling down Sullivan Street, they were still decades in the future. But the lesson had already been written in marble and blood. Perception could protect you more than any gun ever could. So was Vincent the Chin, Giganti, just a loyal soldier, proving himself with a trigger? Or was this the first true glimpse of a mastermind who would one day turn madness into armor and illusion into survival? The gavel struck in 1959, and the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Vito Genovese, the man who had clawed his way to the top through blood and betrayal, stood stiff as a judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison on narcotics charges. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and prosecutors smiled. For law enforcement, it was a triumph. For the mob, it was a power vacuum. But in the shadows of that moment stood Vincent Giganti. The soldier who had once pulled the trigger on Frank Costello now faced a new kind of test. His mentor, the man whose ambition had lifted him into the center of the underworld, was behind bars. The family was suddenly without its head. And when power wobbles, vultures circle. On the streets, whispers filled the cafes. "Genovese is finished," one man muttered over espresso. "The commission won't let him run from a cell." Another shook his head. "Don't count him out. He's got soldiers. He's got the chin." They weren't wrong. Prison didn't break Vito. Orders still slipped past the bars, filtered through coded letters, crooked guards, and loyal lieutenants. And one of those lieutenants, quiet and steady, was Vincent. He had proven his loyalty with a pistol. Now he proved it with patience. While others pushed forward, hungry for the scraps of power left behind, Vincent waited. Patience became his weapon. The FBI expected chaos. They thought Genovese's empire would fracture without him. Other families had splintered when their bosses were taken down. Headlines followed flamboyant dons who strutted, who loved cameras, who craved recognition. But the Genovese family didn't crack. If anything, they grew more disciplined. And behind that discipline was Vincent's silence. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't looking for the spotlight. He was content to be underestimated, the man in the corner of the room, listening more than speaking. That quiet steadiness made him indispensable. He carried messages. He enforced discipline. He kept the gears of the family turning. If someone owed, Vincent saw that they paid. If someone hesitated, Vincent reminded them of their loyalties. Always calmly. Always precisely. He had the patience of a watchmaker's son and the toughness of a fighter who had learned never to show pain. Agents sitting in parked cars saw the pattern. "It's him," one muttered, jotting down notes. "He's the one holding it together." His partner sighed. sipping stale coffee. Yeah, but can you prove it? All I see is a guy walking around the village, not saying much. And there it was again, the paradox. Was Vincent really just a quiet soldier, following orders like any other? Or was he already shaping himself into something greater, building his own invisibility into a shield? The 1960s pulsed with change. Protests shook the city, music blasted from radios, and headlines screamed about war, politics, and civil rights. But beneath the noise, the mob continued its work. Unions, docks, construction, money flowed quietly out of sight. The Genovese family thrived, their power hidden in layers of shadows. Other bosses invited attention. John Gotti would one day strut in silk suits, his trials a circus of flashing cameras. But Vincent learned the opposite lesson. Attention was danger. Attention was death. Invisibility was survival. At home, his double life continued. To his mother, he was still her son, the boy she prayed over each night. To his father, he was still the boy who once dreamed of honest work. But outside those doors, he was something else entirely. He was becoming the man whose silence carried weight in rooms full of killers. Yet something else was taking shape inside him. He had seen how prison hadn't broken veto, how silence had preserved his influence even behind bars. And a seed took root. What if invisibility could be taken further? What if the ultimate shield wasn't just patience and silence, but madness itself? It was only a thought then, a whisper in the back of his mind. But it lingered. The first signs appeared in small ways. A blank stare during questioning, a muttered line in a courtroom, a doctor writing a hesitant note, signs of mental instability. Judges frowned, unsure. Prosecutors gritted their teeth. Could the man they suspected of running the most powerful family in New York really be incompetent? Vincent leaned into the doubt. Slowly at first, then more deliberately. Each time the law tried to drag him into court, he showed a little more confusion. Each time agents thought they had him, doctors offered another report. It was the beginning of something larger, something no one could fully grasp yet, a mask that would become his legend. Meanwhile, in the cafes and social clubs, respect for him only deepened. The chin's smart, one soldier whispered. He doesn't need to talk. He doesn't need to be seen. He lets everyone underestimate him. Another nodded. That's why he'll last longer than any of them. And they were right. Because while other families rose and fell in waves of violence and headlines, Vincent's path was slower, steadier, quieter. By the end of the 1960s, he had become more than a soldier, more than an enforcer. He was the man everyone underestimated, and that invisibility made him powerful. The robe, the slippers, the muttering, they were still years away. But the act had already begun, in courtrooms, in doctors' offices, in the blank looks that confused prosecutors. It wasn't madness, not yet, but it was practice. So was Vincent Gigante just a loyal soldier keeping the machine running while his boss rotted in prison? Or was he already laying the foundation for the performance of a lifetime, the act that would make the FBI chase shadows for decades? In the silence of those years, in the patience that defined him, the answer was taking shape. It began as whispers, not headlines. A blank stare in a courtroom. A muttered line when a judge asked him to speak. A doctor's note hinting at instability. At first, it looked like stress, the toll of years in a violent world. But slowly, piece by piece, Vincent Gigante leaned into those doubts. What started as hesitation became a shield. By the late 1960s, the transformation was in full bloom. Neighbors noticed first. They saw him wandering Sullivan Street in the middle of the day, wrapped in a worn bathrobe, slippers flopping against the pavement. His lips moved constantly, words spilling into the air that no one could understand. Sometimes he stopped at lampposts, pressing his hand against the pole as though listening to it. Other times he muttered to storefront windows, his reflection staring back like a ghost. Poor guy, a shopkeeper whispered to his wife one morning, watching Vincent shuffle past. He's lost it. Kids laughed when they saw him, imitating his slow steps, giggling at his vacant eyes. Parents pulled them close, hushing them, pitying the man in the robe. To the neighborhood, he was just the oddball, the crazy man. But in parked cars nearby, FBI agents watched with narrowed eyes. One scribbled in his notebook. Subject appears incoherent. Behavior consistent with mental illness. Another sighed, shaking his head. This guy's supposed to be the boss? Doesn't add up. And that was the brilliance. Vincent wasn't just acting. He was perfecting a performance. The robe was his costume, the muttering his script, the streets of Greenwich Village his stage. And the world, neighbors, doctors, judges, even the FBI, became his audience. The paradox sharpened. Was he really insane, the victim of a mind broken by years in the underworld? Or was he the sharpest mobster alive, building a shield out of pity and ridicule? Inside the Genovese family, the answer was clear. His soldiers never mocked the robe. They knew better. In private, the chin was sharp, decisive, deliberate. Orders flowed through trusted lieutenants. Money still came in.
Discipline was enforced.
Rivals knew the family's power hadn't faded. The Oddfather act was for the outside world. Inside, Vincent was still the boss. But the act confused even doctors. Some swore he was unfit for trial, citing years of strange behavior, photographs of him shuffling in slippers, medical reports stacked like bricks. Others doubted, pointing to fleeting moments of clarity. Yet the doubt itself was enough. Judges hesitated to put a man who seemed broken on trial. Prosecutors fumed. The FBI stewed in frustration, watching cases collapse under the weight of medical testimony. One evening, an agent snapped a photo of him standing under a street lamp, snow falling softly around him, his robe clinging damp to his shoulders. To the public, the photo was proof of decline, a tragic portrait of a man undone. To prosecutors, it was another obstacle. How could they convince a jury this man ran a criminal empire? But to Vincent, every photo was another brick in the wall. The more the world pitted him, the safer he became. At home, his mother wept at the ridicule. His brothers, one a priest, another in law, struggled to reconcile the act with the man they knew. Was their brother truly sick? Or was he so deep in deception that even family couldn't tell the difference? Their loyalty kept them silent, but their silence only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, in smoky back rooms, the family thrived. Vincent's invisibility became their greatest strength. While other bosses strutted in the spotlight, drawing headlines and indictments, the Genovese family operated quietly, steadily, untouched. The robe wasn't weakness. It was armor stronger than any bodyguard. The FBI knew it. One agent, watching from a surveillance van, muttered to his partner, "He's laughing at us. Every time he shuffles out here, he's telling us we'll never pin him." His partner sighed. "Maybe he's really gone." The first shook his head.
No.
"This is theater. The greatest con we've ever seen." And that's exactly what it was, theater. Madness as camouflage. Weakness as strength. The 1970s solidified the performance. Reporters snapped photos of him wandering the streets at dawn, hair uncombed, muttering to himself. Headlines painted him as a tragic eccentric. Judges shook their heads, filing away medical reports instead of convictions. Prosecutors saw their cases crumble before they even began. Inside the mob, respect only grew. Soldiers whispered, "The chin's untouchable." Rivals cursed their luck. How could you fight a man the law refused to touch because they thought he was insane? It was the perfect shield. But was it all act? Or had the mask begun to blur with reality? Some who saw him in private swore he was sharp as ever, his eyes cold, his orders precise. Others whispered that years of pretending had seeped into him, that the line between the act and the man was no longer clear. That uncertainty only made the legend stronger. By the end of the 1970s, Vincent Gigani wasn't just another mob boss. He was a myth. The Oddfather. The man who fooled the FBI by convincing the world he was broken. His slippers whispered across the sidewalks of Greenwich Village. His muttering drifted into the cold night air. And every step deepened the paradox. Was he insane? Or was he the smartest mobster alive? By the 1980s, New York's underworld had turned into a tale of contrasts. On one side of the city, John Gotti strutted down Mulberry Street in $1,000 suits, flashing gold rings and broad smiles. Reporters loved him. Crowds cheered him. He was the Dapper Don, a gangster who looked more like a movie star than a mob boss. Cameras followed his every move, turning his trials into circus shows. On the other side, in Greenwich Village, Vincent the Chin Gigani shuffled down Sullivan Street in a tattered bathrobe. His slippers scuffed against the pavement. His lips mumbled words that made no sense. Neighbors laughed. Children whispered. "There goes the crazy man," they said.
2 men.
2 bosses. 2 legends. One thrived on being seen. The other survived by being invisible. And while Gotti's headlines drew federal agents like moths to a flame, Vincent's robe deflected them like armor. In FBI surveillance vans, frustration grew. "We've got Gotti on tape again," one agent muttered, tossing transcripts onto a desk. "But Gigante? All I've got is him talking to a lamppost." His partner groaned, rubbing his eyes. "It's like he's daring us." He walks out there in slippers, mumbles a few lines, and our cases collapse. "We're chasing a ghost." But inside the Genovese family, no one doubted. In private meetings, Vincent's voice was clear, his orders precise. Soldiers came and went, slipping envelopes of cash across tables, listening closely to every instruction. The robe, the muttering, the vacant stares, they were part of the act. Behind closed doors, the odd father was still in control. "Don't be fooled by what you see out there," one soldier whispered to a newcomer. "That's for the cops, for the papers. In here, he's sharper than any of them." And it worked. Judges, facing stacks of medical reports and photographs of him shuffling through the village, hesitated. Prosecutors fumed. Cases stalled. Each time the government tried to put him on trial, doctors swore he wasn't fit. Madness is slippery, hard to disprove. And Vincent played it better than anyone. Even the mob's own commission was deceived. In 1986, federal prosecutors celebrated the conviction of Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, a Genovese figure they believed was the boss. Headlines blared, "Genovese boss convicted." But inside the family, men smirked. Salerno was a decoy, a front. The real boss was still wandering the streets in his robe, muttering nonsense, laughing behind the mask. That revelation stunned law enforcement years later. They had spent millions, logged thousands of hours, and they had been chasing the wrong man. Vincent's act had fooled not just neighbors, not just doctors, but the FBI itself. The paradox deepened. To the world, he was a broken man, lost in delusion. To his family, he was a mastermind, turning ridicule into protection. Meanwhile, Gotti basked in the spotlight. Nightclubs, cameras, tabloids. He was the people's gangster, a boss who embraced fame. But fame is a double-edged sword. Each headline drew more investigators. Each photograph added fuel to the cases against him. By the end of the decade, Gotti was behind bars, his empire crumbling under the weight of attention. The odd father, on the other hand, remained free. In the neighborhood, life carried on around him. Mothers pulled their children close when he passed, whispering, "Don't stare." Shopkeepers shook their heads. "Poor man, he's lost it," they said. The robe became as iconic as Gotti's suits, though for the opposite reason. One shouted wealth. The other whispered weakness. And yet, both were calculated choices. Vincent understood something Gotti never did. Perception is power. Let them laugh. Let them pity. The more absurd he appeared, the safer he became. But not everyone was convinced. Some agents caught glimpses of the truth. One evening, hidden microphones picked up his voice, clear, commanding, sharp, inside a social club. When they compared it to the photos of him muttering in the street hours earlier, frustration boiled over. "He's playing us," an agent spat. "Every time we think we've got him, he puts the robe back on and walks right out the door." Still, glimpses weren't proof. In court, evidence mattered more than suspicion. And Vincent never broke character in public. Not once. The 1980s ended with the Genovese family stronger than ever. While other families lost their bosses to prison or violence, Vincent's empire thrived in silence. His men controlled unions, construction sites, gambling, and more. Money flowed steadily, quietly. The Oddfather's invisibility had become his greatest weapon. And yet, the longer the act went on, the blurrier the line became. Some whispered that he had worn the mask so long it had become part of him. Others swore he was still as sharp as ever, never slipping, always in control. Which was it? That question haunted everyone, from neighbors who pitted him, to agents who obsessed over him, to rival bosses who envied him. Was Vincent Gigani truly insane? Or was he the sharpest mobster alive, a man who had turned madness itself into a business strategy? By the early 1990s, the robe was no longer just a disguise. It was legend. Neighbors in Greenwich Village barely blinked anymore when they saw Vincent the Chin, Gigani muttering to himself in slippers. To them, he was just the crazy old man, drifting through the streets like a ghost. To the press, he was the Oddfather, the punchline to late-night jokes. But to the FBI, the act had become an obsession. They had spent decades watching him, decades writing reports, staking out social clubs, snapping photographs. And every time they thought they had enough to drag him into court, his lawyers rolled out a fresh stack of medical evaluations. Mr. Gigani suffers from advanced mental illness, one psychiatrist declared. He is unfit to stand trial. Judges hesitated. Prosecutors fumed. Agents slammed their fists against desks. One veteran agent leaned back in his chair after another failed hearing, shaking his head. "He's not crazy," he muttered. "He's playing us." The robe, the muttering, it's theater. His partner sighed. "Maybe. But you can't put a man on trial for acting crazy. Not when every doctor swears he's unfit. We need proof. Real proof." And that became the mission of the 1990s. To tear down the mask. The FBI bugged social clubs, planted wires, leaned on informants harder than ever. They followed Vincent's men day and night, hoping for a crack. And eventually, cracks began to show. Informants whispered what the robe concealed. One former soldier, facing years behind bars under RICO laws, told prosecutors, "Don't be fooled.
He's sharp.
He gives orders. He's the boss." Another added, "The robe's for you guys. For us, he's all business." It wasn't just whispers. Hidden microphones caught moments the robe couldn't hide. One tape recorded him speaking clearly in a club, discussing money and territory. Hours later, agents photographed him shuffling down Sullivan Street, muttering nonsense. The contrast was maddening. See, an agent slammed the tape onto a conference table. One minute he's running the family, the next he's pretending to talk to invisible people. This is fraud. The greatest con we've ever seen. But glimpses weren't enough. In court, the robe still carried weight. Judges still leaned on decades of medical reports. Prosecutors still struggled to make the illusion crumble. So Vincent leaned harder into the act. The more the law pushed, the stranger he became. He wandered at odd hours, stared blankly at nothing, spoke louder to the air as if answering voices only he could hear. Every performance deepened the myth. Every mutter made it harder to pin him down. Yet time was shifting. The 1990s brought a new generation of prosecutors, sharper tools, and a determination to prove that the Oddfather was no madman. Slowly, the cases stacked higher. One by one, his buffers, the soldiers and lieutenants who had shielded him, fell under pressure. Some flipped, trading silence for survival. The circle around him began to thin. Inside prison walls, whispers reached him. Men who had once sworn loyalty were talking. Some swore he was still untouchable. Others muttered that maybe the mask had become too convincing, that maybe even Vincent himself was caught between the act and reality. In the village, neighbors stayed oblivious. They petted the man in the robe, whispering to their children, "Don't laugh at him." Shopkeepers shook their heads when he passed. "Such a shame," they said. The disguise still worked perfectly in public. But the FBI wasn't buying it anymore. By 1997, after years of relentless pursuit, prosecutors finally secured indictments they believed could break him. Witnesses testified. Tapes played. Informants described meetings where Vincent was sharp and clear. For the first time in decades, the robe looked less like proof and more like a costume. In the courtroom, the battle of perception raged. Defense lawyers pointed to photographs of him wandering in slippers, to psychiatrists who insisted he was mentally gone. Prosecutors fired back with tapes, with testimonies, with the mounting evidence of a man too precise, too calculating, to be the fool he pretended. One prosecutor stood before the jury and declared, "Ladies and gentlemen, you are not looking at a madman. You are looking at the most brilliant fraud in organized crime history." Still, Vincent never broke character. Sitting at the defense table, he slumped, his eyes blank, lips moving faintly as though speaking to ghosts. To some jurors, it looked real. To others, it looked staged. The uncertainty was his greatest weapon. But the tide had shifted. After years of cat and mouse, the FBI had finally clawed through the illusion. In 1997, Vincent Gigani was indicted for racketeering and conspiracy. The robe could no longer protect him. For law enforcement, it was vindication. "We finally got him," one agent whispered outside the courthouse, his voice thick with relief. "After 30 years, we've pulled the mask off." Yet, even in defeat, the paradox lingered. Was he truly acting all along? Or had the performance become reality after so many years? Some guards swore he still wandered prison halls muttering nonsense, even when no cameras watched. Others insisted he was laughing behind the mask until the end. The odd father had survived longer than anyone expected. He had turned madness into armor, ridicule into a shield. And though the FBI had finally cracked the case, even they admitted it, no one had ever played the system like Vincent Gigani. The robe was unraveling, but the legend was only growing stronger. So the question remained. Was the man in slippers a victim of insanity, or the sharpest mobster the FBI had ever faced? The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every hallway buzzing. Journalists jostled for space, cameras flashed, and prosecutors shuffled thick stacks of files like weapons. After decades of frustration, the FBI had finally dragged Vincent the Chin Gigante into the light. He shuffled in slowly, head bowed, his prison uniform hanging loose on his frail frame. His lips moved faintly, as though he was whispering to someone only he could see. The audience leaned in. Was this the feared boss of the Genovese family, or just a broken old man? That was the paradox. The same paradox that had haunted the FBI for 30 years. Was he truly insane, or the sharpest mobster alive? Prosecutors made their case with fire. They played tapes of Vincent speaking clearly in social clubs, his voice sharp, his orders precise. They brought in witnesses, former soldiers, lieutenants, who admitted he had run the family from the shadows. One said, "The robe? That's for you guys. For us, he was the boss." Another added, "He gave orders. He decided who got paid, who got hurt. Always him." The jury listened, their eyes flicking between the man on the tapes and the man slumped at the defense table. Two Vincents. Which one was real? Defense lawyers fought back just as hard. They held up photographs of him wandering the streets in slippers, muttering at lampposts. They presented psychiatrists who swore he was delusional, incapable of understanding the charges. "This is a sick man," one doctor testified. "He cannot possibly lead an organized crime family." At times, Vincent played his part to perfection. He stared blankly at the ceiling. He mumbled incoherently. He dozed mid-hearing, his chin dropping to his chest as if the trial itself had no hold on him. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, wondering if they were watching a man unravel in real time. But prosecutors pressed on. One turned to the jury and declared, "Do not be fooled. This is not madness. This is manipulation. The greatest con in the history of organized crime." For weeks, the trial swung between illusion and revelation. Tapes versus photographs. Sharp orders versus blank stares. Informants swearing he was sane versus doctors insisting he wasn't. The robe had always been armor, but now it was evidence. Was it proof of illness or proof of deception? One FBI agent who had chased him for years sat in the gallery, arms folded. When a tape of Vincent giving clear instructions played, the agent leaned to a colleague and whispered, "There he is. That's the real Chin." The jury agreed. In 1997, after decades of dodging, Vincent Gigani was convicted of racketeering and conspiracy. The robe could no longer protect him. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse. "The Oddfather falls," one headline read the next morning. "Madman or mastermind?" asked another. Even in defeat, the paradox clung to him. As he was led back to prison, Vincent gave no explanation, no confession, no break in character. He mumbled faintly, eyes cast down, as if still lost in a world only he could see. For the FBI, the victory was sweet but incomplete. They had put him away, but they still couldn't answer the question that had haunted them for years. Had they been chasing a genius in disguise, or had they really been fooled by a man who had lost his mind? Inside prison, Vincent's life shrank to routine. His health deteriorated, his body weakened. Guards whispered among themselves. Some swore he was still sharp, hiding behind the mask even now. Others believed the years of pretending had become reality, that the mask and the man had finally fused into one. In the neighborhood, old residents shook their heads. "We thought he was crazy," one said, watching the news. "Turns out he was running the whole thing." Another muttered, "Smartest guy I ever heard of." Who else could fool the FBI for 30 years? The Genovese family didn't collapse with his conviction. The structure he had built, layers of buffers, chains of command, invisibility as strategy, remained intact. His lessons of silence and patience outlived him, woven into the DNA of the organization. But for Vincent himself, the walls of prison marked the final act. The robe was gone. The slippers were replaced by prison shoes. The muttering continued, but now it echoed off concrete walls instead of village sidewalks. Even then, the legend grew. Documentaries replayed the grainy photographs of him wandering the streets. True crime books retold the story of the Oddfather, the man who had made weakness his greatest weapon. And always, the question lingered. Was it real madness or the sharpest performance in mob history? In the end, maybe even Vincent himself wasn't sure. The walls of prison closed around Vincent the Chin Gigani. Gone were the sidewalks of Sullivan Street, the shopkeepers whispering pity, the neighbors pulling their children close when he shuffled by in slippers. Now it was steel doors, buzzing locks, and fluorescent lights that never dimmed. The robe was gone. The slippers replaced by state-issued shoes. Yet the muttering continued, echoing down the halls of the prison infirmary. Guards watched him carefully. Some swore he was still acting, still putting on the mask that had protected him for decades. Others shook their heads. "Nah," one whispered to another, "he's gone. The act's over. He's lost in his own world." Even in confinement, the paradox lingered. His health began to fail. The years weighed on him, bending his shoulders, dimming his eyes. Doctors visited often, their reports filling file after file. Was this the same man who had once ordered hits and moved millions through construction rackets and union deals? The same man who had made the FBI chase their tails for 30 years? Or was he now what he had pretended to be all along, a broken, fragile soul? In 2003, the world got an answer of sorts. Through his lawyers, Vincent admitted in court that his decades-long insanity act had been exactly that, an act. A deliberate, calculated performance designed to keep him out of prison. The robe, the slippers, the muttering, it had all been theater. A fraud, prosecutors called it. The Oddfather had finally confessed. But the confession didn't end the debate. If anything, it deepened it. To maintain a performance for 30 years through trials, through hospital visits, through daily life, didn't that take a kind of madness on its own? Had he simply pretended, or had the mask become part of him, seeping so deep that even he no longer knew where the act ended and the truth began? By then, Vincent was a shadow of his former self. Frail, sickly, often confined to a wheelchair. Yet his name still carried weight. In the outside world, journalists wrote about him as a master manipulator, a genius of survival. In the underworld, his legend lived on as the boss who had turned weakness into the strongest armor of all. Even in prison, men lowered their voices when they spoke of the Chin. For the Genovese family, his lessons outlived him. While other crime families collapsed under flashy bosses and public trials, the Genovese remained steady, invisible, disciplined. They had learned from Vincent that invisibility was power, that silence was survival. His shadow lingered in every decision they made. On December 19, 2005, Vincent Gigante died at the Federal Prison Hospital in Springfield, Missouri. He was 77 years old. The news spread quickly, filling headlines across New York. The Oddfather dead at 77. Madman or mastermind? Reporters struggled to capture him in a single phrase. Was he the ruthless enforcer who once shot Frank Costello? The cunning strategist who ran the Genovese family from the shadows? Or the eccentric ghost who fooled the FBI with a bathrobe and slippers? He was all of these and none of them completely. In Greenwich Village, old neighbors remembered the sight of him shuffling past, muttering at lampposts. Some pitied him, even after the truth came out. "We thought he was just a poor crazy man," one woman told a reporter. "Turns out he was the boss all along." Others admired him. "Smartest guy of them all," a shopkeeper muttered. "He fooled everybody." For law enforcement, his death closed a frustrating chapter. They had finally caged him, but only after decades of humiliation. "He made us look like fools," one retired agent admitted. "You don't forget that. He was the best at what he did." And for the world beyond New York, his story became folklore. Documentaries replayed grainy photographs of him in robes. True crime books detailed the deception. Late-night hosts joked about the Oddfather. But beneath the jokes lay a haunting truth. He had done what no other mob boss ever managed. He had turned madness into a strategy, ridicule into a shield. He had fooled the world. The paradox endures. Was Vincent Gigante truly insane, a man broken by the weight of his own world? Or was he a criminal genius, laughing quietly behind the mask until the very end? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps the mask became the man, and the man became the mask. Perhaps, in his final years, even Vincent himself no longer knew the difference. The robe is gone. The slippers are silent. But the story remains, told in whispers in cafes, written in files in FBI archives, replayed in documentaries long after his death. Vincent the Chin Gigante, the Oddfather, left behind not just an empire, but a legend. A lesson in invisibility, a masterclass in deception, a performance so complete it blurred the line between illusion and reality. And in the end, maybe that was his greatest victory. Not the money, not the power, not even the freedom he stole for decades. His greatest victory was the mystery. Because even now, years after his death, the world still asks the same question it asked when he shuffled under those dim streetlights in Greenwich Village, muttering to himself. Was he insane? Or was he the smartest mobster alive?